And we have new guests on our panel. Ian Burgess, who is CEO of the Medical Technology Association of Australia. They deal with devices and gizmos. David Simmons, Professor of Medicine at Western Sydney University, an expert in diabetes and models of care, and implementing innovation there. Michelle Haber, who is Director of the Children's Cancer Institute on the Randwick campus. Please welcome our panel. And of course, Anushka. Let's pick up on this value proposition and the move to outcomes. Ian Burgess, I'm glad Ian Jacobs isn't here because he's going to have a go at me for being negative, but let's just start off here. Medical technology has been credited with increasing healthcare costs considerably. You've got the robot, the surgical robot, flavor of the moment. Not a single study shows any benefit of the robot whatsoever. Costs a lot of money. Every operation is $3,000 in consumables, takes longer to operate. Laser surgery for cataract, no benefit, costs a lot more. Spinal surgery, they're introducing new screws every year. The National Joint Replacement Registry shows that the older, cheaper joints are the better joints and more reliable joints. Every year the pacemaker manufacturers are bringing out a new gizmo on a pacemaker with minimal benefit, but it's costing more money. How do we actually change the value chain when the profit of the device industries is actually not with innovation, it's just a little bit more of me too?
Thanks for that question, Norman.
Can we have the house lights up, please, so that we can see who wants to ask questions and make a comment? So full lights, please. Thanks.
So certainly innovation in medical devices can be expensive. And I could equally choose other devices as examples of where there is a value being provided.
I'm sure you would, but...
And where there are savings both in terms of the specific medical procedure and savings for the health system as a whole. And I think the challenge we have with our health system is the silos within our system and the regulatory and both the reimbursement frameworks around that.
But you do quite well out of the reimbursement system. The prosthetics list allows you to charge, highest margins in the world almost for devices in Australia. We would save hundreds of millions of dollars in the private sector if we charge, for example, the prices paid in France. So, regulation goes your way.
Again, you can be selective in terms of choosing
I'm a journalist,
international comparisons. And there are differences in costs in serving the Australian market. And there are differences in the health systems in those different markets as well, including patient gap payments, which can be extensive in those other jurisdictions.
I just want, I don't want to. Obviously, innovation is important. You've got cancer, you want the latest drug. But Michelle, that recent study in the British Medical Journal shows that for a lot of the new cancer drugs that have come on the market recently, minimal benefit for massive cost. Very small survival advantages, and the cost is enormous, $75,000 to $100,000. When the taxpayer, who's the community wants to donate to medical research, believes that their community, giving it for the cure for cancer and innovation and translation, and yet when it comes back to us, it's unaffordable and the value is really questionable. How do we deal with that? We're going to go along this innovation pathway and then my point here is, create products that are unaffordable.
Yeah, so I think that the affordability and the sustainability of innovation in healthcare is absolutely critical. And I'll use as an example the personalised medicine program that we're just setting up for all children in the country with cancer, which will be equity of access, free personalised medicine, providing the opportunity for matching the best drug to target in each of the children at highest risk to give them the greatest chance of survival. And so we've had tremendous support from that, from government, from philanthropy, from peer-reviewed system, bringing together, leveraging all of those. And at the end of the day, this can't be for 3 years. We have to be able to demonstrate that this has health economic benefit, that the health implementation studies are done in parallel with that, the behavioural and psychosocial studies are done with that, to be able to demonstrate that there is a cost benefit to that there is a welfare benefit to the community and a cost benefit to the community in terms of being able to show that these changed models of care can ultimately benefit the community as well as the individual.
Now, we've got an open market. Profit is not a dirty word. People have got entitled to make money out of their innovation and hard work, no question about that. But, you know, Gilead, when challenged for their hepatitis C drug, why they're charging $80,000 a course, it was on the value basis. We're saving you on liver transplantation, et cetera, for a drug that costs $180 to manufacture. So the question then is, and people argue that if the same argument had been made for polio vaccine, we wouldn't have been able to afford polio vaccine. How do we engage with industry in an open market to allow reasonable profits without super profits? Because it's hard to disrupt that industry because they've got a monopoly.
Yeah, and I think that has to become a partnership between industry and academia, where you have to get industry reinvesting profits into academia to help develop new ways of doing things. And again, those opportunities, I think we have to be very innovative about how we're doing that. Again, with the implementation of precision medicine, the drug companies want to be developing these drugs. They know that there are enormous markets, but if they're not working with industry, with academia to help show the benefit of their drugs in various populations, then they're not going to be able to leverage off that. And so I think it is about new models, government providing incentives to industry to reduce, to reinvest that profit into academia so that it does become a virtual cycle in a new and different way to what we've had in the past. And I think it does require dialogue between the community, government and industry to change that paradigm.
Melissa?
I also think we need to think differently here. I think we need to re-engage our regulatory partners. I think the TGA needs to be much more involved with the process. The TGA almost missed the boat in North America, where companies got sick of having to go through this very expensive process for things that were based on predicate technologies. And so they were going right to Europe and going through the CE mark system to save money because it was just prohibitively costly. The FDA was nimble and they upped the ante. They basically created the 510K pathway for rapid translation. And I think it's really important for us to engage TGA and vice versa so that at an international level, we invite industry to go through these pathways.
So do you think that will end up with reduced cost to the consumer and to the taxpayer? So, for example, the industry has been not telling the truth about development costs, for example. So a recent study looking at, I think, a collection of 10 or 15 new cancer drugs where you could actually measure the cost of development, it was about 10% of what the industry say they actually spend on development. So there's, transparency is actually not there at the moment.
And that's across the board, I think. Ethics and integrity, we all have to raise the level, raise the bar, and do our best. I don't think that's just industry. It's across the board with quality of data that's coming out, and it's up to us. I mean, it's up to us to be excellent and be role models for that and lead.
So, David, how to move towards, I mean, Michelle's point and the general point we're making here is if you can demonstrate the outcome, then you've got a starting point for a discussion about value. How do we move towards an outcome-based discussion in the Australian context so that you actually know that what you do is getting the outcome? Because you can't do a randomized trial for everything.
I think that the framework in which we're discussing is about innovation and commercialization and the money, I think is one area which obviously is important. But I think a population health approach and actually looking at population-based outcomes and having a way to benchmark either through quality of life years or one of the other measures and say, well, what is it that we want to pay for? And some of the technology is unaffordable, and I think we should say it is unaffordable. And we should focus on some of those things which we should be investing in even now, some of the aspects of prevention, which isn't innovation. People changing their lifestyle is not really innovation. There are some tools that can support it. But I think that we need to look at that other side of things, which is how do we benchmark what we are putting our money into as taxpayers. Commerce will carry on and people will continue to try to compete with their products. That is what they will do. But we need some way to decide, is this affordable if it's going to go through a public system?
So Anushka, how do you do that? Because you're still going to have to measure outcomes. You've got that complex project in Indonesia, and you described the other one in Australia. How do you actually move forward there? Because we are not good. No country is good at measuring outcomes to know that when you press the button on this, you're going to get the result there. Is it more clinical registries? Is it? I mean, what's the end point? Because we all want to move up the value chain, but how do we actually do it? And what are the data that are required so that you've got a kind of level playing field, and if you're going to innovate, whether it be in prevention, health services research, technology of various kinds, you know what you're aiming for?
Yeah, I think there's an enormous opportunity for data to transform the way that we innovate in healthcare delivery. The reality is that if you take my area, for example, in cardiovascular disease, new drugs, new devices, new technology is going to make incremental changes in outcomes. What's going to really push the dial is translating what we already know. What we already know is effective, and that requires in itself innovation. But that in complex health systems, it's impossible to influence everything. It's impossible to develop innovations that are going to have penicillin-like effects. They're going to be moderate and they're going to be incremental, and that's the reality. And I think having reliable outcome data that's continuously available to continuously innovate in that healthcare delivery environment and continuously evaluate and learn is absolutely crucial. And it's challenging in countries like it's possible here in Australia, but it's not that straightforward. And there are many challenges. We can do it a lot better, but in many other economies, it's almost impossible.
Suvan, it's hard to create a market for prevention. There's no waiting list for prevention, there's no money in it. What could be the role, if at all, of entrepreneurial philanthropy, as you describe it, in public health and prevention?
Well, I think whether it's philanthropy or government, first of all, the issue is partnership. Nobody can do it alone, and it impacts everyone. So if everybody's kind of at the table, which is amazing to me in Australia, that you are all at the table. You may not agree, but you are all at the table. For our entire country to be on the same page about translational research, which takes risk, which takes entrepreneurism, which takes innovation, which takes all of these individual partners, government, industry, and everyone, to be at the table to try to figure out. I guess I come from the world of business, and the only way to bring prices down is competition. So government should be funding other technologies or others
increasing
that can
supply
to have the competition bring the markets down. And then I think in reference to foundations, they should be partners in this entrepreneurial risk-taking because they are specifically designed to be able to take risks. And I'm not sure that foundations really understand that they, of all people, of all institutions, should be taking risks, should be doing entrepreneurial philanthropy.
So the model is that the NHMRCs, the NIHs, the MRCs and others fund the funnel, and entrepreneurialism and philanthropy pulls it out of the funnel.
Go with the valley of death, because government and industry is not going to fund the gap funding, that valley of death of proof of principle. So therefore, I think the foundation should be stepping in. And some businesses who will invest in that startup stage, and then industry will finish the job with their clinical research.
So Melissa, what's your view in the Australian context of this, of philanthropy as the de-risking device, if you like, in the pathway, whether it be prevention or product development, so that you actually get investment at the other end of the valley by government or industry?
Well, there's quite a lot of track record in this area if you look at the Gates Foundation and other such foundations. But certainly if you want to look at diseases that aren't being covered by industry or government, philanthropy has stepped up for things like malaria and tuberculosis. The Coulter Foundation in America and the Whitaker Foundation had a tremendous impact on the development of the educational and the R&D structures. The Burroughs Wellcome Foundation in Britain had similar, and the EU has tremendous programs that go cross-nationally to address these issues. I think if I talk with my colleagues here in Australia, and I'm now part of the Australian family, we recognize that philanthropy isn't as well developed as it could be and as it is in other places. And I think that's something that we can encourage those who have to step up to the plate and make this one.
Could I just add to that? And I realize I don't know the state of philanthropy or foundations in Australia, but there's government agencies that can fund basic. But then there also should be government agencies that fund translational, because philanthropy is not going to cover it all anyway.
Of course. So David, you're in a high prevalence area for obesity, diabetes, population health is an extremely important part. What are the main facilitators of moving forward to a better place when it comes to those population health issues, so that you actually have a more enabling environment?
I think it does come down to the term partnership. It's quite interesting we talk about partnership and competition, because in some ways they're two different things. So we actually would rather work together. We're competing against death and premature damage, and I think that is actually what we're competing with. And I think we're looking at how do we have primary care and secondary care, whether private or public. How do we actually work together, and what are the facilitators of that? One of those may be big data. But actually, when you stand back, the major problems that I would see as a clinician is the governance aspects. How do I make sure that good care is being delivered, and how do we make sure that it's articulated? So there's also the communication aspects.
So transactional costs.
Absolutely, and those costs are very high, and we're not sharing data in the way that we should be in the real world, as much as people may be talking about it.
Time for a couple of quick comments. If you want to raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. There's somebody there in the sort of middle there, if you get on the other side. Thanks. Pass the parcel.
Oh, translational research always wants you to have an outcome within 2-3 years. Huh? So what do we tell scientists where there is nothing translates? So I'm coming from the area of Alzheimer's disease, and we don't have any drug after 20 years of hard work. How do we fund basic science to actually create a pipeline for translation for diseases where there's nothing?
So the sound quality is terrible when we're on the stage. So can I assume that your question was about continuity beyond the 2 or 3 years of the basic science? Sorry, you probably all heard that clearly, and we on the stage didn't.
Yeah, I have a German accent, so this is the problem. Huh?
No,
German accent. Huh? So I'm talking about diseases where there's nothing to translate. For example, in the area of Alzheimer's disease, there's nothing to translate because we don't have any medications. So how do we fund basic science to go back to the drawing board and create medications for this disease?
So it's about the value proposition if you don't have the data moving forward. Yep.
Could I make a quick comment on that? I see basic science as really, it's applied research that's just got a longer time scale. That's how I see it. That's where we make fundamental discoveries that will get translated at some stage down the line. That's where we discover disruptive technologies as well. So I see it as completely intertwined.
Yes, another comment here.
What would you say if someone were to challenge that the problem with a very commercial and competitive paradigm is perhaps very different to what we need in health, especially public health in the areas you talked about, David? So how do we position strategic prioritised research, strategic prioritised translation, and actually take control back from the chaos to do what's most important through collaboration. So how do we disrupt through collaboration?
So the question is, I really am sorry, it's terrible to hear on the stage, but it's about prioritization. So you've got commercial imperatives, but you've also got priorities to be set. And how do you balance that and gain control of the priority setting? I think that was the...
Almost. How do you use collaboration to disrupt? So instead of competition and commercialisation and making money out of health, how can we use collaboration and be strategic and prioritised?
I'll have a first go at that. I think that collaboration is the only way for us to do this effectively, and I'll take issue with the original assertion that we're very bad at doing that in Australia. I think that there are some outstanding examples of collaboration, national partnership, international partnership, partnership with government, with industry, with medical research institutes. And I actually think having that dialogue about what is the clinical need, I think it has to start there.
So the patient is the disruptor?
The patient is the disruptor. What is the biggest challenge and how do we address that? And then sitting down and working out together how you go forward. And it's really, I find that is the single motivator. And when you put everything else aside and you say, what is it that we're trying to do here and what's important, that's when you begin a conversation that brings people to the table. And I'm a great optimist, and I find that it actually works if you start from that premise.
Anushka, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think in the area that I work in around innovation and implementation, involving industry early in the pathway, as we've done with in a number of examples, because as we heard from the presentation by WebEx, that there are so many industries now getting involved, for example, in the digital health world, technology industries that have very little grounding in healthcare, for example. And so the partnership model at a very early stage, such that the innovation can occur in the context of the eventual business offering, is as crucial for the business partner as it is for the entrepreneur or the innovator. So I think that's one model that's effective.
And just finally, Ian Burgess, in terms of unlocking innovative potential, most of your members are overseas corporations. We're about creating Australian industry and I know that you do have Australian members, in the device area. What would be the biggest barrier to overcome to unlock innovation and create Australian businesses in devices?
Sorry, it's really bad audio here. I'm not getting a lot of what you're saying.
So my question was, I'll come closer and talk quieter, is what would unlock the innovative potential to realise a bigger Australian device industry? Because most of your members are overseas corporations.
Yeah, most of our members are actually Australian companies, but in terms of the size of the companies, it's the larger multinationals that do dominate the industry. But about 50% of our members are Australian and 80% are SMEs.
So improving value and making them larger, what needs to be unlocked?
Well, I think Australia has a great environment. We have a great academia, we have great clinical trials. There's improvements that can be made around the regulatory processes on clinical trials. There's improvements that can be made in our taxation system. It's ensuring that we have a stable taxation system. We're particularly concerned about the potential removal of the R&D tax incentive, which is a big issue for our smaller companies. That would have a significant adverse impact on the Australian innovation by the small companies. So it's a combination of the political environment, the taxation environment. The work that MTP Connect is doing is fantastic in terms of bringing together the various stakeholders in the system. And it's encouraging those Australian companies to do that. There is with the large multinational companies, they are active in Australian innovation as well. Some of those companies invest in Australian startups and partner with Australian startups. So it's not quite as simplistic in terms of that differentiation that you draw.
Good. Could you please thank our panelists?